The men who ran these rigs wrote history. This is the Forest Museum at Duncan on Vancouver Island. And these are the tools of yesterday's loggers. Their work was rough and dangerous at times, but it laid the foundation for BC's basic industry and for the province's economy for years to come. Next on the scene were the foresters, who measured the forests and looked for ways to manage them. Forestry's come a long way since its modest beginnings. Forest companies use high technology to plan and carry out the harvest. Foresters use high technology to renew the value and beauty of BC's prime resource. The story of these people, loggers, foresters, mill workers, is the story of British Columbia. The native peoples of the coast were the first, of course, to put its magnificent timber to work. They carved totems and canoes and built houses with workable red cedar. Captain James Cook became the first European logger of West Coast trees in 1778, when he sailed from Nootka Sound with coastal trees as spars. More Europeans came to harvest timber. Hand-cut lumber was sold by fur traders at Fort St. John in 1806. Pit sawyers cut BC logs into lumber, and hewers cut logs into timber using flat-bladed axes. In 1843, the Hudson's Bay Company built the first mechanized mill, driven by a water wheel, near Esquimalt Harbor in Vancouver Island. From this and other mills, schooners took lumber to Valparaiso, Shanghai, and Australia. In the woods, loggers felled the big trees with axes and cross-cut saws. They moved them with ropes, blocks, and teams. They skidded them on grease logs or sent them roaring down flumes to the water.
One of the big problems has always been the size of the logs. Most of the timber in the Cowichan district was fairly large, and the falling of the big trees took very skilled men and very fine type of men to cut them down with hand saws, make the big undercuts and then cut them down. And this is a problem that didn't arise in many other parts of the world. In fact, the whole of logging here has been a problem of handling the big, heavy logs, particularly on the steep, rocky side hills and so on. So we've had a rougher and a more difficult time of it than most any other country. History of logging has been how to get the logs moved from where they were to where you wanted them. So if you can visualize Vancouver, what it was like before the city was there, when it was, Burrard Inlet was all trees. Originally, all the trees were felled right around the water's edge. And then they were hand-logged into the water, jacked in with jacks and so on, and partly pulled in with boats. But then when they'd gone around the first fringe, then they had to use oxen in order to pull the logs into the water. And after that, oxen being so slow, you weren't able to go back more than, say, a quarter of a mile to a half a mile with oxen because it was so slow. Then horses replaced them on the skid roads. And the horses were, well, both horses in a good country that wasn't too rocky and too rough. They could go back quite a long way, up to a mile on a skid road, pulling a long string of logs. But then the steam age came in, and gradually the railways were built, and they became more and more efficient. The logs were taken out by steam donkeys, yarding them and loading them, and steam logging railways bringing them down to the water. There were probably 15 or more logging companies with railroads just in this district, if I remember right. And they worked very efficiently until after the turn of the century, and then we began to get into a gasoline age. Well, of course, the original automobiles and gas engines were laughed at, but trucks were built. And World War I brought along the development of the truck to the point where it could handle much heavier loads And so trucks were used for logging in certain places on shorter hauls. The big problem with trucks to begin with were the tires wouldn't stand the hard work, and not only that, your brakes were not sufficient when you came down hills. But as time went on, tires became much bigger and better, and truck engines became more and more powerful, and you got air brakes, and you were able to hold a truck back coming down a steep hill. And so by the time we'd got to the end of World War I, trucks had developed to such a point that it was cheaper now to log with a truck than it was with a railway. So almost overnight the trucks came in and they just took over. And by 1950 there was hardly a logging railway left.
BC forestry officially began with the Forest Act of 1912. The BC Forest Service was formed, and the order was given, count the trees. It took 25 years on foot and on horseback, on boats, trains, and biplanes, but the foresters came up with an inventory. While they were counting the trees, other foresters were already thinking about how to renew the forest.
I was at the Elk Falls Park the winter of 1937-38, where we had 100 men in the camp. It was a relief camp. And our main project that winter, of course, was development of the park. But long after New Year's, in the spring of 1938, we understood that there were being 50,000 trees to be planted by our crew. And to me, who'd had nothing to do with reforestation, it was just pretty hard to realize planting 50,000 trees. Where today you think nothing of talking in terms of 50 million trees.
To renew the forest, you need seedlings to plant. In 1929, the Forest Service set up its first research station at Cowichan Lake to look into reforestation. In 1930, the Green Timbers Nursery went into operation near New Westminster. When the 1938 Sayward Fire blackened 30,000 hectares of forest on Vancouver Island, seedlings from green timbers were planted there.
Sayward area, of course, was a wonderful piece of timber there, and by the time sort of I came into the picture, it was in the late 1930s, a great portion of it had been logged. And then in 1938, they had the big Campbell River forest fire that burnt off something in excess of 60,000 acres. And at that time, you could look from Campbell River to Courtenay pretty nearly, and you'd see nothing but a sea of snags and very little green stuff showing. Well, of course, after that fire, it was realized that this area, if it was ever going to come back, had to be planted up. And the Green Timbers Nursery was the only nursery in the province at that time, and it wasn't producing many trees up to that time either. So it was decided to put in a nursery at Campbell River, primarily to provide trees to plant up the Sayward.
The view of the Sloan Commission in 1945 was that the first growth forest was a gift, and that hard work was needed to produce the next growth. This presented a huge challenge. Producing a new forest in a province where rainfall can vary from 8 centimeters a year to 500 centimeters a year, where topography, temperature, and tree species can be so different. Faced with renewing the forest, the industry changed its view of tree species. It had favored its world-famous Douglas fir, the light, strong Sitka spruce used widely for aircraft, and the appealing western red cedar. Hemlock, balsam, and pine were considered weeds. Now they began to be harvested and sold. In the Caribou and the Kootenays, the industry developed differently. Hundreds of bush mills sprang up along rail lines, particularly through the Caribou. Then in the 1960s, the industry found ways to turn mill waste into profitable pulp. 3 pulp mills went up in Prince George alone, and the interior forest industry was on its way. In 1965 and 66, 360 small mills around Prince George were bought out by larger companies. For the first time in the interior, the logs came to the mill instead of the other way around. With the 1970s came rapid changes in technology. Computer-aided sawmilling, pulp processing, research and planning. The inventory branch, which had started its work on horseback in 1912, was now working with computer-generated maps. Foresters used to watch for smoke from lonely towers. Today, a province-wide system detects every lightning strike in fire season. In 1976, the Pierce Commission recommended an integrated approach to forest management. Manage the forest for all its products and uses. Now we are in the age of the managed forest. In 1987, the ministry's target is 200 million seedlings planted. Advances in genetics, in tree breeding, in tree growing, in harvesting, in sharing the forest. All are being put to work to preserve and improve BC's prime resource.
While timber production continues to be among the most important and probably the most important product of the forest, there's no question that many of these other goods and services of the forest are increasing in value faster than is timber. So outdoor recreation, for example, is burgeoning, and to manage a forest for recreational purposes requires doing things a little differently than just managing the forest for timber production. The same is true of managing it for wildlife and fisheries and water production. The history of our forest industry in this part of the world has been one of harvesting away at the timber stock that we were endowed with by nature. We tended to take the best timber first, and gradually over the years we moved further back, further into the mountains, up onto the high elevation sites, and we're getting to the stage now where we can see the end of it. So in the future, what we can expect is that the concentration of forest production will move back down off those mountaintops and those remote areas into the more fertile valley bottoms where you can grow crops and manage them much like you do agricultural crops. Instead of taking what nature has provided for us, we'll be growing crops that are adapted to the needs of the marketplace, the kinds of products that the market will want in the future.
There will always be a need for the forests and for their products. Caring wisely for them today helps to assure that they'll help care for us tomorrow.